Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Yvonne Garcia, Chair of the Chamber's Women's Network Advisory Board and Chief of Staff to the Chairman and CEO and Head of Global Communications at State Street. I'd like to take a moment and help virtually introduce all of our attendees today. I hope you'll take a moment to say hello in the chat to your fellow attendees and share thoughts throughout the program. And as you know, if you've been part of our events before, we are really big on sharing our story via social media. So please use hashtag BossBizWomen and the @Boston Chamber. Also, if you have any questions for our guest speakers, please feel free to put them in the Q&A feature on your screens. And lastly, in case you have colleagues or friends that would like to view the program, we record each of our programs and it'll be posted on our YouTube page next week. So I'm really excited about today's program because it's something that I've had to deal with. It's something that I'm sure many of you have had to deal with. And it's that whole notion of the imposter syndrome. So today's program, we have a fantastic panel that's going to talk about this phenomenon and that's become to be known as this imposter syndrome. You know, constantly asking ourselves, do we belong here? Or did I just get lucky? Or do I really deserve this role? Am I a fraud? Am I just standing in for someone? So if you've ever kind of asked yourself any of these questions or ever doubted your achievements in the workplace, you're not alone. We have all been there. But it's really equally important to recognize that the imposter syndrome could also just be a notion that's constructed from bias. Our expert panel will get really candid about their personal experiences with it, how it can impact your career, and more importantly, the workplace culture and the leadership approach. They'll also offer advice on how to overcome it and even use these feelings for positive change. You know, when I think about it, I always remind myself that I deserve to have a seat at the table, that I belong, and that regardless of who is around me, that there is some type of, that I'm there for a reason and that I add value. And it's really important that we continue to remind ourselves that we belong and that we have earned the right to be there. But the imposter syndrome is something that is a real struggle at times. And unfortunately, I've seen it get in the way of women being able to move on and evolve in their career. So I really am excited about the panel today because they are going to address that. And it's extremely important that we recognize it, but that more importantly, that we never let it get in the way of moving forward. So with that, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our Women's Network sponsor, MFS. You know, their continued support and partnership have allowed us to continue to bring the content like the one that we are bringing to you today. So with that, I'd like to welcome Maureen Bryan. She's the VP Compliance Officer for MFS, and she will introduce today's featured speakers. Thank you and welcome, Maureen.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. I actually feel very honored to have a seat at this table today. And on behalf of MFS, it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel of very inspiring women. So joining us from Bentley University, I'm happy to welcome Trish Foster, Executive Director at the Center for Women in Business, where she sets the strategy and guides thought leadership for so many young women. Trish is passionate about advocating for inclusion and allyship, as well as developing and delivering DEI programs for organizations. Next, we have Beth Chandler, CEO and President of YW Boston. Beth has extensive experience in both the corporate and nonprofit sectors with business development, evaluation, and operations. In her role, she leads the organization as it strives to build a more inclusive environment in the city of Boston, and she's dedicated to eliminating racism and empowering women. Our next speaker is Osa Fanelli, founder and chief strategist at Idea Lift Group. Osa specializes in leadership development, board governance, and strategic planning. She's passionate about increasing performance and well-being in both life and work by supporting the growth of more effective, compassionate leaders and engaged collaborative teams. She has over 25 years of experience and has led teams in 35 countries and over 5 continents. And now I'd like to welcome Ketty-Ann Cadet. Ketty-Ann is CEO and founder of Women with Purpose, as well as an organizational design senior consultant at Deloitte. She leveraged her experience in learning and development, program management, and monitoring and evaluation to create Women with Purpose. It's an organization that offers professional development programs, as well as a network of diverse women to empower and support women of color and make a lasting social impact. And then leading today's conversation is Purvi Trivedi, Head of Customer Engineering at Google Cloud New England. She leads a brilliant team of engineers to solve the biggest challenges for the largest customers using Google Cloud technologies. Purvi has almost 20 years of experience in advising companies of all sizes in collaboration and digital transformation. She's passionate about mentoring and fostering the next generation of women technologists and leaders. So we're honored to have you all here today, and I can't wait to get into the discussion. So I'll turn it over to you, Purvi.
Thank you, Maureen. So I want to start with a confession. I feel like an imposter several times a day. As you can imagine, working for Google gives me the opportunity to work with the brightest minds around the world. But several times during the day, I have imposter moments sprinkled across from meetings where I am with engineers that are brilliant, knowledgeable, and they can go very deep on topics that I can only scratch the surface. Not to be self-deprecating in any way, I am bright, I'm a good leader, and it's a constant reminder to myself that I bring strengths that help us progress conversations as well. So I'm really excited to be able to moderate this panel with inspiring and accomplished leaders with us. I want to start the conversation by talking a little bit about the definition of imposter syndrome. So give me a moment and I will share my screen with all of you. Awesome. So imposter syndrome is the feeling that you are not actually qualified for the success you have or the work you are doing, and the fear that you will be discovered as a fraud. It's that inability to connect our success and our accomplishments with qualities that are internal, like intelligence, skills, knowledge. It is not a psychological disorder. It is not a personality trait. It's that moment in time experience where, depending on where you are in your life or your comparison group, all of us experience it. A report done by the International Behavioral Science Journal shows that 70% of the respondents have experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their career. The two nuggets of information from the study that I think were really powerful were, first one was women reported the symptoms of imposter syndrome more than men did, and African Americans reported feeling the effects of imposter syndrome more when they were a minority in a group. And I think being in tech, I see both of these day in and day out. Let's take the definition into how it actually makes us feel. When we're feeling those imposter moments, we feel like what we know is the little yellow circle that you see on my screen, and what everyone else knows is all encompassing and much greater than what we know. However, the reality is we have a lot of knowledge, we know a lot of information, and there's just a small subset, as you can see on the right of my screen, that overlaps between what you know and what others know. So it's really important not to devalue your perspective, your experience, your skill, and what you bring to the table. Because by bringing your full self to work and being able to share a diverse perspective, all of us can collectively make better decisions. I want to do a fun, thought-provoking exercise with all of you. So leverage the chat component within the meeting and tell me two things. Who is the woman on my screen, and what are her accomplishments? How do you perceive her? So I will give you all 20 seconds to just share your reflections, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so this is Maya Angelou, and here is a quote from her. I have written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they are going to find out now. I have run a game on everyone, and they're going to find me out. This is a social rights activist, a renowned author, award-winning poet, and with all the success, when she is ready to put her publication out there, her creative work out there, this is the sentiment that comes to mind. And I think Yvonne highlighted this really well early on. The more successful we are, the more we feel imposter syndrome. And I'm really excited to kick off the conversation with our inspiring panelists. So let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Perfect. And let me come to the conversation. I feel very lucky to have these panelists with us, and I'd like to start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about what your understanding of imposter syndrome is, where you may have experienced it in your career, and how putting a name to it has led you to think any differently about yourself and your career. Let me come to you first, Trish.
Purvi, thank you. And hello, it's so great to see you and to be here with all of these amazing folks. Thank you so much. So I am going to give you my personal description of what my moments of imposter syndrome are like. It's a light bulb flashing in my head saying, I don't deserve to be here. These folks who hired me must have made a mistake. Now, we know there are all sorts of fabulous definitions out there, and I'll leave it to others to share those. It's definitely that self-doubt that you already described, Purvi. I have dealt with it numerous times in my career, and like you said, Purvi, sometimes it crops up when you least expect it. It's in the middle of doing something for a client. It's in the middle of getting a project done. But my two big touch points that I want to share from my journey, from my career journey, are at one point I was the only woman on a management team in a very male-dominated environment. And even though they were great, there was, I was definitely dealing with a sense of isolation and micro inequities. I dealt with it a lot then. I also dealt with it after taking a career break to raise kids and returning when I had to take a step back in order to get to on-ramp, to get back. And that was tough. I have been really lucky to be able to put a name on it. And the reason I'm so lucky is because the work I do, I develop programs and deliver them for people in organizations. And so, we all know that we can confront our demons and we can learn by teaching others and helping others. And that is a phenomenal way that I've been able to name it and address it for myself.
Carrie-Ann, let me come to you. Let me bring you into the conversation as well.
Of course, and talk about a powerhouse. I'm already feeling a little bit of that imposter syndrome just being here, but let's talk about at least my interpretation of it. For me, it's when I feel as if I don't belong in a room, either professionally, financially, from a socioeconomic perspective, from a racial perspective. That's my interpretation. And I say that because growing up, I've been a first-generation Haitian American and a female of color. I come from a high social class. And so I've always been the first or the only in each of those descriptors I've just said to you, either because of my race or because of my age or because of my social class or because of my religion. Everything that defines me, I've found myself in a room that I'm usually the first or the only. And so the way that I feel as if I've overcome those is, and the way that actually, let me explain, the way that I see it or feel it the most is when I'm speaking. Because in an email or in a classroom or in a professional setting, I'm behind a computer. No one can really tell, well, sometimes because of my name, but no one can really tell who this person is behind my name. But when I'm usually presenting or speaking in a forum like such, that's when you can really see me, and that's when I feel the most vulnerable. So the way that I try to tackle it, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's really understanding what makes me unique. All those individual descriptors are the reasons why I'm probably been asked to be on this panel, or I'm having the opportunity to share my perspective. So love that we're having this conversation, and I definitely feel the imposter syndrome definitely has a diverse or very different definition depending on who you are.
Great insight. Also, would love to have you chime in as well.
Sure. And wow, I'm so happy to be with all these beautiful women to have such an important conversation. And I couldn't agree more with already what has been said. You know, for me, the imposter syndrome is a very harsh voice. It's a judge, it's an inner critic. It talks to me in a way that nobody else really talks to me. And it's not pleasant when it starts. And it can be several voices, like an orchestra in my head. And I feel like it comes and goes all the time. It doesn't go away. We can only try to manage it better. But one of my moments in life, I think, was when I moved to a new job here in Boston many years ago, and I had been promoted to this, executive job, and I moved from Rome in Italy, where the previous year I'd been through a lot of difficulties. I had a husband who had passed away very young in cancer. I had overcome cancer myself. I had been juggling this career, and here I was, single mom with 2 little boys, 4 and 6 years old, who moved to Boston without speaking any English. And even though I had been chosen for this job because of a track record, I suppose, that imposter syndrome totally took me over. It paralyzed me. And I could not for the world understand, why was I chosen? They're going to find out that I'm not capable. I'm not enough. I'm not worthy for this job. And it was horrible. It was horrible to feel that. Luckily, in that situation, a lot that helped me was mentors, beautiful women, peers and colleagues that really helped me with that. And later on now, what really helps me is the practices that I've been doing now for many years, both personally, but also teaching mindfulness and emotional intelligence, and knowing that and recognize that I am not my thoughts. We are not our thoughts. There are tools, there is ways that we can skillfully navigate how we respond to the imposter syndrome, instead to what happened to me, being hooked by these feelings.
I am not my thoughts. That is such a powerful statement. Beth, I will come to you next.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And I guess what I will add to what everyone else has said, I think it's also, for me, I am not what other people think. Right. And so oftentimes when I think about an imposter syndrome, it's often because of what is said to me. When I went to college, I went to Harvard, I played basketball, and I was asked numerous times, did I get in because I was a basketball player or affirmative action or both? Right. People discounted anything else, but that's why I was there. And I've been in other situations where those kinds of questions are asked. And so, in hearing people ask those questions, then it caused me to wonder, well, do I deserve to be here? And I think for people who have marginalized identities, we're often asked why we are in some place, whether directly or indirectly. And then when we look around, we don't see others that look like us, right? And so then you do start to wonder, well, am I here because of what I bring? And what I contribute, or am I here just to check somebody's box? So it's, I still struggle with it today, but I am trying to have my own practice of not worrying about what other people think. And I tell my kids all the time, there are plenty of people that are going to put you down throughout your life. So you can't really think about what others are saying. You have to really focus on what are you saying and what do you believe about yourself. But it's hard when all the messages around you, and particularly depending on your identities, aren't always positive.
Beautifully said. And I think the audience can relate to feeling like, am I a checkbox? I will say that when I have my imposter moments throughout the day, I am the only woman in the room. And that definitely triggers that. This was some really insightful conversations and learning about each of your journeys. I also think that imposter syndrome can stem from a variety of factors. It could be personal, it could be social experiences, stereotypes, the corporate, the organizational culture, as well as the work dynamics. And also you touched a little bit about your mindfulness and your emotional intelligence practice. And I'd like to start with you on the following questions. How can we differentiate the feeling of feeling like an imposter versus having the high expectations for ourselves, setting goals that may push us outside of our comfort zone?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to sort of honor, before I talk about some of that mindfulness, that it's a very different thing if the imposter syndrome is coming from an inner voice, right? And we're secretly doubting and making up these narratives, or if it's actually somebody or a workplace that's making us feel that and our greater society. So I just want to be we're going to talk more about that, but just so I don't confuse the two things, because I think it's very important to think of that. But yes, so I think there are lots of things that we can do on an individual basis if we start by searching inside ourselves. And that's what I work with a lot. And you working at Google know about the program Search Inside Yourself, which is mindfulness-based and neuroscience to really build our emotional intelligence. And I think it's important. It helped me when I found out that there's actually evolutionary biology behind this voice in our head, right? So, it goes back thousands of years as a survival mechanism. We had to survive from animals eating us. Now in 21st century, we don't have that problem, but we still have the same reaction, right? So we have this alarm system in our brain that's constantly detecting threat, especially to our ego. So that goes off, the amygdala often goes off and puts us in these, defensive mode. And it also, unfortunately, really affects how we see things. As humans, we have a negativity bias. So we have to constantly remember that we tend, as humans, totally normal, to see more of the negative than seeing the positive, even about ourselves. So that part is important to know that we can change that. We can change it. And it's so cool through this gift of neuroplasticity that we can actually, just like we go to the gym and build our biceps, we can actually change the neural pathways of our own brains. So if we're constantly telling ourselves, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, you're enforcing that highway in your brain, versus if you're sort of using tools which I really like, are especially self-compassion, and that's a whole research and a lot more I can say about that, but where we're treating ourselves as a dear friend. I mean, my inner critic, the way it talks to me, I would never talk to a friend like that. So really going back to how can I be my own friend? How can I treat myself with kindness? And the last thing I will say is to look out when we're setting our goals. One of my inner critics is perfectionism. And I think a lot of us women have this thing, especially if we feel imposter syndrome, where we have to prove ourselves. We have to work extra hard to show that we're worthy. And that can totally burn us out. So to know that perfectionism doesn't exist. We are imperfectly perfect as we are. And how can we work on that to accept that?
Let me take a quick pause to see if anyone else wants to build on how to differentiate between imposter and setting high expectations for ourselves.
I don't mind jumping in, and I love how you just broke that down, Asa, so thank you so much. And one thing I want to build off on is the internal versus external that you pointed out in the beginning. The way that I see challenging myself is usually an internal conversation. I want to beat me. Like, I want to push myself to exceed the goals that I had last month, to exceed the goals that I had last year. I want to achieve X for my professional development or for my financial abundance. It's usually an internal conversation. And Beth, you also mentioned a little bit too, but when you think about the imposter syndrome, you're usually thinking about the external, right? What are other people saying about me? Or what are other people seeing me for who I am, right? So that's how I differentiate seeing one as goal setting or being maybe a stickler on yourself versus that imposter syndrome is the internal versus the external. So how do I push myself to move the imposter syndrome to be a little bit more towards goal setting? It's thinking about what you say to yourself, which has already been said, and I think that's fantastic, but also looking at your story. So 2 strategies that I would have in terms of shifting it from imposter syndrome to challenging yourself. 1, make a list of your journey. Literally list it out, where you went to middle school, where you went to high school, what did you do after that? Did you go to college? Did you go to work? Have you traveled? Talk about your family members. On 1 piece of paper, write out your journey. And after each of those milestones, if you will, under it, 1 thing that you've learned. Doing that activity, no one else on this earth, I can guarantee you, has that journey. No one else, right? And so if anything, that becomes your power play. Now, the next thing to do is, now that you have these ideas or these moments that make you, right? That make you unique and make you special. Sometimes we need that extra validation to be like, yeah, you are pretty cool, or you do know what you're doing, or you are very smart, or you are very X, Y, and Z. Sometimes writing it on a piece of paper ourselves isn't enough. I do a 360 evaluation every year. I send out the same email asking 5 questions to people from my social network and my professional network. And I ask them 5 questions around, what are things that are memorable about what I do? Where do I excel? What makes you comes to me for questions or advice? How can I, differentiate myself moving forward? And what am I lacking? Every year, it may not be the same people, but it's the same questions. Now, the result is that I then get several emails of other people validating about what makes me me. Sometimes if I want to go a little bit extra, I try to add or match what they're saying to my journey to say, what so-and-so said, I learned it here. Or what so-and-so said, I learned it here. The point of me giving you these strategies of these 2 points is that at the end of the day, you're trying to shift from what other people are saying about you or seeing about you, which sometimes it's all in your head, to more about how can I push myself internally. So hopefully that's a helpful way of differentiating the both, but also having a strategy to move from one towards the other.
Thank you. I think both Osa and Katie Ann hinted a little bit towards this, the external factors, right? What does the workplace culture, what kind of impact does it have? And does that increase the feeling of the imposter feeling in women? Historically, the way imposter syndrome is viewed, it puts the onus on the individual. Though in these current times, as we talk more about intersectionality and analyze the environments from which these feelings emerge, and also touched a little bit on this as well, I think we now see the shift in thinking that we need to fix the environment versus the individual. Beth, your work with the YW includes helping workplaces and organizations adapt policy, change practices, and attitude towards creating a much more inclusive organization, workplace for all women, but especially women of color. So I'd like to come to you first for the next question. I think the audience would benefit from hearing your thoughts on how can we pivot the focus to looking at the organization, the workplace, and not necessarily the individual?
Sure, it's a great question, and that's in part why we made this shift to helping organizations create more inclusive environments about 4 years ago, is because before then it seemed like a lot of the focus was on individuals, right? And let's have a leadership program for women. Let's have a leadership program for people of color. Let's fix them. What can we do to change them, fix them, make them better? And so it was a deficit-based model, right? So how can you not have self-doubt if everything out there is telling you there's something wrong with you and you have to change? And our take was there are a plethora of qualified women, people of color, and it's the environments that are the problem. It's not them. So how do we help organizations take a look internally to say, what are we doing that may be getting in the way from everybody being able to thrive? Because no organization, well, let me say not many organizations want to exclusively want to disadvantage groups, one group over another, right? There are some that are intentional that want to, But by and large, groups, our organizations aren't trying to do that. But they don't understand how systems of oppression work and how they're playing out within organizations. And I'll just give one example. We worked with an organization, and women of color there shared that they were not having opportunities to be on high profile cases. And those were the cases that led to people being able to move up in the organization. And the organization looked at their data and they realized that that was indeed true. When they looked at all their high profile cases for the past 5 or 6 years, there were very few women of color and people of color that were on those cases. So then they dug a little deeper and they realized that one of their practices was that managers got to pick their project teams. And so part of our bias as human beings is we're attracted to people who are like us, right? So managers were primarily white, primarily men. So they picked primarily white men who resembled them. They went to the same schools, had the same hobbies, went to the same, did the same things. And it wasn't that they were being intentional about excluding others. It was just their default for who they were picking. And so they ended up perpetuating this thing of only, primarily white men being on teams. And so they had the opportunity to advance. So when the organization shifted and said, you know what, we're going to be much more intentional about how we put these teams together, they saw a ton of benefit in the organization because people now realize the value that their colleagues were bringing to different projects because they were working with different people. They were now working with women of color, men of color, other folks, transgender folks, and they had an opportunity to see the value that they brought to the team. And people started requesting, when there were opportunities to request other people to serve on their teams. And that was because, there was a policy in place that ended up having an outcome that nobody wanted. Right. And people in that organization started to think initially that women of color weren't qualified, right? Because they're not seeing them on these project teams. So why am I going to pick them? No one else is picking them. They must not be qualified. So it was reinforcing this idea, right? So if you're in that environment and you're not getting picked, then it's hard to not think there must be something wrong with me, right? But there was nothing wrong with the women. It was the process of how teams were selected and what that ended up being. And so I think it's very hard to disentangle, environments not having a huge impact on particularly marginalized people self-doubting, right? Because when we look around, we don't see us in leadership positions. When we look around, we don't see us, with power. And so it's easy to say, well, then maybe I shouldn't be here. Right. And so that's why we focus on helping organizations understand what's happening internally. How can they look at their data to understand where there may be policies, practices, beliefs that are leading to outcomes that they don't want, and helping them understand how to change those. So again, everybody thrives, because if everyone thrives in an organization and succeeds, and everybody benefits. Right? Because that means the organization is going to grow because everybody's able to contribute to the best of their ability.
What a powerful example. A small story that I can share is that Google, as a manager, when I get a packet for a candidate, everyone puts feedback in as the candidate. We don't say he, she, or their name. And that is to remove the bias that you have, the unconscious bias of wanting to hire people just like you. So that's very well said. Trish, I would love for your thoughts on this as well.
I am really resonating with the notion of intersectionality as it relates to this topic. And I think a lot of people wouldn't at first blush think it did, right? This gets a little bit complicated. And Beth, thank you so much for what you walked us through. I think what I can only do is add a few things on the edges. When I think about the impacts of socialization on women, particularly dealing with imposter syndrome, I think about how we are still taught today in 2021 to be more humble, to be better listeners, to be highly collaborative, all of which can be wonderful attributes, but we know all of which can also show up as micro inequities that erode our confidence. So layer those experiences that pretty much all women are having, with the mixed messages and the stereotypes that women of color are confronting every day. How Black women are literally seen as angry when they assert themselves. How Asian women are sexualized. How the model minority myth intersects with race. And how this directly relates to these folks being oppressed, to being held back. And we could definitely get into other identities, but we have to talk about race and the intersection with gender because it is so profound. And I wanted to bring up a more benign example for a moment of the ways we've been told we need to be fixed instead of the organization or the larger culture understanding, no, they need to adapt. And sometimes the benign examples help us get our heads around it. So I'm going to go for it here and talk about how forever women have been being told that they need to speak more like men. So we're told that, when we talk, we have to stop doing an uplift at the end of our sentences to make a point, or that we apologize too much. Yet there is a body of evidence out there that shows us that the reason we do it is we have learned over time that it's an effective way to communicate, that it's a conversation smoother, that it helps us better connect to people. And I think that just beautifully illustrates a wrong that is done. And we need to be aware of those wrongs that are done and expectations that are put on the person being oppressed all the time, whether that's around, your status as LGBTQ+, as a man, as a woman, around age, around ability and disability, whatever it might be. We have to have those bias interrupters that remind us, am I looking at this person and expecting something different of them based on their identity? And is that fair?
I love the word bias interrupters, right? It could be conscious or unconscious bias, but just taking a pause to recognize that could be playing a role before you react and continue to do what you've always done. That's really powerful. And I think we talked a little bit about internal and external. And the quote that really kept coming back to me as both of you were talking was, "No one belongs here more than you," from Brene Brown. And I feel like if each of us had that there, I think it helps us combat the imposter moments that we have. Catty Ann, I want to come to you. At Women with Purpose, you create safe and inclusive networks for women to lead authentically and help women of color not only become a better version of themselves, but also empower other women and other underrepresented folks. What is some advice and strategies you could share with our audience in terms of bringing your whole self to work, bringing your best self to work? And as a leader, how do I and many other leaders that are on this call create that environment where employees can be vulnerable and honest about what they're dealing with?
Love that question. So I hope I don't cause a fire or alarm, but I am not an advocate of bringing your best self to work. Quite frankly, it's very difficult, and there's always a consequence or series of consequences when that does happen because, to be quite frank, not everyone, or depending on whom you're working with or who is in front of you, needs to see that, and it's not necessarily appropriate. Let me say, for example, I'm a consultant by day, and when I interact with my clients, there are certain things about me, about my personality that may not necessarily, don't forget, I'm representing my firm, right? That best represents the firm. Not to say that it's bad, but I think it's all about pivoting and switching. What I do love about what you asked is about how do you bring your best self? So for example, I know I'm a great communicator. I know I'm a great facilitator. I know that I'm very relatable. Those are some of the aspects that I bring in at the office versus my whole entire self that might be more comfortable, relaxed with my family or my husband. But the three strategies to your question, one, I personally believe that everyone has a purpose, right, on this earth. Everyone has a purpose, hence why The startup Women with Purpose has the terminology purpose in it. One strategy I think is very important is to use your experiences to articulate that purpose, however and by whatever means as possible. Why? Because that starts to build up your brand. So for example, I have lived abroad for about 4 years because before coming to working at Deloitte, I worked in international development. Whenever and however I can, if it's appropriate, I like to relay those experiences because it's led to my purpose. And my purpose, I believe, is to use my experiences and charisma to help other people find the value of who they are. Now, there's no way I can reach my purpose without finding those connecting points with individuals. So sometimes I may say, oh, great, Purvi, that's a fun question that you just asked. It reminds me of the time when I lived in Paris as a student and I did X, Y, and Z. I start to bring in my experiences every now and then because I'm trying to find a connecting point with you and I, but I also want it to build up in terms of what makes me me and what makes me unique. And Purvi, hopefully you'll remember, Kitsen said something about being in Paris, and that might be some connecting point that you and I may have further on in the future. So my first strategy, and something that we encourage women at Women with Purpose, is your experience is very unique to you, but no one else knows it. So articulate it and use it however way possible to articulate your purpose. I think another point here that's important and that we do share with all the women who go to our professional development seminars is calling out when you're feeling vulnerable. You'd be surprised what that does to the other person on this side in terms of feeling a sense of connectivity and relatability with you if you really call it out. For example, my first speaking engagement I was 20 years old. I had just interned in a mediation firm in Boston, and the managing director, who to this day I value as a mentor, asked me to co-lead a negotiation training for about 60 nonprofit professionals. I was still a junior at Boston College. I had never, done a training like such before. I had gone through the training myself, but I had never facilitated a session. I remember that first day, all of the things we talked about, feeling imposter syndrome. What am I doing here? I am still in college. These folks are a lot older than me. I've negotiated a few times, mainly with my parents, but what do I know about negotiation, right? My first introductory speech, I called it out. Hey everyone, I'm super nervous. This is my first time speaking. Hopefully I don't fumble around on myself. But calling it out not only made me feel more at ease, it made everyone feel a little bit sense of connectivity and an understanding with me. And I honestly think that if we do that a little bit more often, calling it out about feeling vulnerable, you'd be surprised on what that does for your external view of imposter syndrome in these moments. So I would say that those two things are strategies that we encourage all the women that participate in our professional development seminars as they're developing themselves professionally and personally. One is using your experience, right, to articulate your purpose in however way it's possible. And two, calling it out. Your vulnerability will make a lot more partners than you would imagine.
Beautiful. Those were some excellent strategies. And I see, Trish, you were about to say something as well.
Only because it just is a perfect follow-on. So Ketty-Ann, I always teach vulnerability as a strategy as well. It's essential. And so thank you, that resonates. And what I think fits perfectly with it is another strategy that I use, which is teaching people how to have really honest conversations. We refer to them as brave dialogue. In our center, people talk about them as courageous conversation, right? We all have whatever our name is for, but that goes hand in hand with vulnerability. And again, this is really related to this issue, because if people could learn to be able to speak up and name their own moments of self-doubt, their own times where they've been vulnerable, if some of the micro inequities that people deal with that are weighing them down could be discussed in these safe settings of brave dialogue, you'd be establishing a framework in your organization where people could bring this stuff to light, right? Because one of the problems is it's not talked about. And my quick story on this that just still blows me away when I think of where we are, 2021, right? And I've been doing this for a long time. And I go into workplaces and run workshops and give talks. And either before I go in or during or after, women come to me and they are senior, impressive seasoned women, and they say, we need you to bring something into the room that we don't feel comfortable bringing into the room. And more often than not, it goes something like this. One week I am told I lack executive presence. The next week I am told I'm too aggressive. So they're dealing with the double bind still in 2021. They're afraid to talk about it with their male peers or their male bosses. And so of course nothing is getting done. And yet that's eroding their confidence. That is feeding into imposter syndrome. So I would love to see every organization embrace a culture of brave dialogue to address some of this.
That was such a beautiful add-on, right? Brave, courageous conversation, radical candor. Let's give the folks that are underrepresented radical candor too, so they can continue to grow, versus the fear that as a male manager, I don't know if I want to give this person the feedback. And I have seen that happen often. I want to switch gears to taking some questions from our audience. One of the questions that I see here that ties really well with what Katie Ann had said about the first time she presented and just saying, hey, I may have an imposter moment. That's what this question ties well to. How do you fight imposter syndrome when it might hit you at meetings, group conversation, or in a public arena? How do you make sure that your thoughts and ideas are not silenced due to the internal or external imposter syndrome? It would be awesome if each of you could maybe share one strategy each. But shall we start with you?
Sure. I think that one thing that I try to do when I have those moments, particularly if I'm in a large room and have a thought and wondering how people react, is to just take a deep breath and to remember that no one else has my perspective, and my perspective is just as important as anybody else's in the room. And if I don't say it, then no one else might. And so I take a deep breath, I gather my thoughts, and I jump in.
Awesome. Osa, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I'm with Beth. I think you can never undervalue 3 deep breaths. It actually calms down our whole system, literally. So a couple of tricks I do is just that: stop in the moment before you react, before you respond, before you're too triggered. Breathe deeply 3 times. And then sometimes an add-in phrase, depending on what the moment is. One can be breathing in, I do my best, and breathing out, I let go of the rest. Because in that moment, I just need to sort of know what Beth said, that I can do this and I'm doing my best. And there are many such, in the moment practices, but I think breathing is actually a simple act. It's all free. We all have it right here. And yet we tend to forget to use it sometimes.
I think we answered this question, but I want to put it out there in case any of the panelists have additional thoughts on it. Is imposter syndrome itself constructed, or another thing women have to fix? Is it really about confidence? And I feel like the last part of the question, we haven't had an opportunity to talk about how confidence is a muscle that you have to build and strengthen. Trish, you touched a little bit about this, but I want to put it out to the panelists.
I could take it or get us started. I think that's such a good question because, again, we talked earlier, right? Beth talked about it and I talked about it. This shouldn't be about changing people. On the other hand, we do want to help ourselves. So men definitely, and again, forgive the binary here, but I'm going to use it for simplicity right now. Men definitely experience imposter syndrome and self-doubt, but the literature does show us, the research is out there to show us that in general, women internalize our mistakes more than men do, and that is a big factor in this feeling of imposter syndrome. So we do need to learn to work on certain things. Yes, should we be in organizations that are more inclusive and that support us? Absolutely. That has to get fixed. But in the meantime, we want to do what we can to help ourselves and lift ourselves up, which does mean working on imposter syndrome and confidence, which we keep saying is a muscle that can be flexed. It truly is.
Trisha, quote that comes to mind that you had shared with me was, success is as much about competence as it is about confidence. And I wrote it down when you said it because I was like, yes.
You were reading my mind, Purvi, and that was going to be my final takeaway. But so success correlates just as much with competence as with confidence. When you think about that, that's a pretty compelling case to address your own confidence. And the one other thing I was just going to say is, one example of how you can kind of turn things around for yourself a little bit is taking mistakes that we really internalize and looking at them as beautiful learning opportunities. That's a mental shift. And we can do that, but we have to do it very intentionally.
Yeah, very well said. I want us to spend a few minutes talking about allyship. For many of us, allyship doesn't come naturally and it has to be learned. We often hear people don't always know how to continuously practice allyship. So I want to ask all of you this question. Do you consider yourself an ally? And can you share with our audience how you practice allyship? Are there any tips and tricks that you can share with our audience? And let me start with you, Katie-Ann.
I love this question, especially after last summer with the Black Lives Matter protest. I had a lot of peers and friends and colleagues of mine just reach out and ask, how can I help? How can I help? One, I always say, everyone educate yourself first and foremost. That's the number one way you can help. But I love the fact that there's that little bit of vulnerability asking, hey, I'm willing to learn. What can I do? I consider myself an ally, or I have the opportunity. I'm not an ally, but I have the opportunity to be an ally for everything that I am not. I have the opportunity to be an ally for someone who is homosexual or within the LGBT community, for a Latina, for white, for someone of different religion as me. I have the opportunity to be an ally to anybody within those intersectionalities or demographics that don't represent me. Now, what am I an ally for is a different question, because I think allyship is intentional, right? It's a verb. You have to act, you have to do. And as of late, I've been an ally for my LGBTQ peers at work, and also my Latina men and women at work. The way that I've been an ally is, one, having a conversation, one-on-ones, coffee chats. Also, two, learning about what are their challenges that they're facing. I did a podcast actually at work on allyship, and I quite frankly asked everyone, when was the last time you had a one-on-one Zoom call, right, with someone who didn't look like you? That is a pure, simple act of allyship. It is not that wild. It is finding someone who you know does not represent anything or does not look like you, does not have any similarities with you, and simply having a Zoom call with that individual, asking them about who they are, what is their background, what's their story, what are their experiences. That learning and getting to know someone is an act of allyship. And then the second bit is, when was the last time you coached or advocated for someone, quite frankly, that didn't look like you? And that can look like a number of things. Saying to someone in a meeting, you know what, that's a great point. Or sending an email to someone's manager and saying, hey, I saw so-and-so do this work. I think they're phenomenal at what they do. Keep it going. Or putting someone up for promotion that does not look like, just there's so many small micro steps to do an allyship that I think people underestimate. And they think that allyship is this huge, boastful act that it's not that. It's one, making that connection with someone, and then two, micro steps of supporting them in ways that they don't have to see. It doesn't have to be a big, boastful act. But as of late, because of some of the acts that have been happening last year and as this year as well. For example, a lot of our LGBTQ, especially in the transvestite community, have been murdered. Transgender community have been murdered, and there have been no solution to those cases. I found myself having more of those conversations and asking, or educating myself more or less, and then also advocating for those peers of mine in the workplace.
Micro steps, that's such a great way to think about it. The little things you do that build up to helping someone. Osa, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I don't think I can say if I'm an ally. I think it shows in my behavior and in my actions. That's for others to say if I am. I try to be. I have in the last year especially, but even before, educated myself. It's a lifelong journey. And my number one step goes back to the same: search inside myself, looking at my own unconscious biases, looking at how I'm conditioned, using my privilege to speak up for others, seeing and sitting in that discomfort of fear, knowing the systemic racism and racial inequalities that exist. So really going in first to look at how I can, what do I have to work on to be able to be an ally and to educate myself. I also think that leaders, can do a lot in the workplace, building psychological safety, a place where people might not bring their whole self, but they feel they can speak up. They feel they're trusted. They feel it matters and they can make mistakes. Because in such a setting, I think that you can learn about mindful listening, for example. Like, am I being curious here? Am I really listening to this person, or am I just waiting to respond? How many times does that happen? We're not really listening to this person. We're not listening to BIPOC people. And just sometimes we just have to sort of stop ourselves. And that's where I think compassion and common humanity comes in. Like, how can I be of service to someone else? And sometimes that is speaking up on behalf of others. Sometimes it's just being quiet and just feeling the feelings of somebody else and really tuning into that. So I think, as leaders, as women, yes, I think a lot of us are trying to really be allies, but it's a lifelong journey. And I will never stop learning. And I hope I will be able to be there to make the difference that we have to make in our country.
That's beautiful insight. With 3 minutes to go, I'd like for each of you, are there any last minute thoughts that you want to share with our audience before we wrap up this conversation? And Beth, I see you off the microphone, so I'll have you go first.
Oh, I was going to answer the other question because I don't like the term allyship. I actually did a blog on it. I hate it. Sorry for those that do like it, because it doesn't go deep enough for me. And so I don't know if I have a term that I like. I'm leaning a little towards venturist, and I think of sort of a venture capitalist where you're investing something and you have something to lose. And that to me is what I don't always get with allyship. I think there really has to be an investment. And for the person who is, in that role, are you willing to sacrifice something, right? Because that's what really has to happen, is we have to be able, as Asa said, to use our privilege. And all of us have privilege in some way, shape, or form. And are we willing to use that privilege? And are we willing to, in some cases, maybe lose something so that others gain, right? And that's how we move forward. And that, to me, is important and sometimes gets missed, I think, in the allyship conversation. And one closing thought, I think it's really important for folks to give themselves grace. Right? We don't give ourselves and others enough grace because we're all human. We're all here to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And so we have to, be gracious to ourselves and forgive ourselves when we make a mistake, and give grace to others as well.
Well said. Trish, any parting thoughts?
I would add that we should all think about what it really means to be authentic and to feel inner confidence and strength, and define it for ourselves. Don't define it according to the standard of others. And when we do that, we are going to be more centered and more purposeful and on a more positive journey.
Thank you. Osa, any parting thoughts?
I can't see everyone on the call, but all I want to say is to really think about this. You matter. And being a human, you are worthy and good enough just the way you are. And lastly, you're not alone. So I just want to leave with that.
Gideon, to you.
This is hard. These are all so good. I always keep the Joseph Campbell quote, the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, right? No one's me, no one's you, no one has your experiences, no one has your voice or the things that you've gone through, and that is unique to you. So remember, whenever you are in a room where you feel as if the odds are stacked against you, no one can deny your experience, right? So always leverage that.
Panelists, thank you all very much for all the great insights, inspiring us, giving us strategies to combat imposter syndrome. For those of you that have stayed for one more minute, Danielle will share with you, I Am Remarkable. This is a Google initiative. It's a 90-minute workshop where you get to go talk about gender and norms that we have always been accustomed to, and then tools and techniques that you can use to empower yourself, to use data, to self-promote, and build the confidence muscle that we have talked about in this conversation. And with that note, Celia, I'm going to pass it to you. Sorry, we ran over a tiny bit.
No. All I want to say is thank you. I appreciate all of you. We all do. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your expertise and sharing it with us. It's a really dreary day, and I think this conversation alone helped me. So thank you. Thank you to our sponsor, MFS, and Purvi, especially to you. It's not easy to moderate. It's the hardest job. So you did fantastic. Thank you so much. And everyone have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.